Here's a couple of wee examples of the questions we were doing yesterday, even today, right? So what we've got is, one of the questions is, if you've got sine x, and that is at 0.990, and what we're looking for is, we're looking for two values of x, okay, when it's at 0.990. So what we do is, we obviously want to find out x, so we have to take the inverse sine of sine, and that means that we have to take the inverse sine of 0.990. Now with this wee diagram, it's a positive sign, so what we can say is, we can say it's positive in this quadrant, which is quadrant number 1, and sine is positive in quadrant number 2. So what we can say is, for the value of x in quadrant number 1, that's just the value of the inverse of sine, right? So you just put that in the calculator, so you'll just go, in this one, shift sine, we'll say that's 0.990. So what we've got is, in quadrant 1, the value of x is, just say, 81.9 degrees. Okay. Now we've got another value to find for x, because x can take 81.9 degrees in quadrant 1, but it also takes another value when it's in quadrant 2. And to work that one out, all we do is we say it's 180 degrees minus what you've worked out for quadrant 1. So what we have is 180, and we say minus 81.9. So that is 98.1 degrees. Now if you think about the actual graph of sine, remember, it comes up and then it goes back down. So what you probably find that that's quite close to here. So when it's very close to the top of it, right? So it will be not too far apart in terms of these two values. So if we look at another wee question, what about if I just say sine x equals 0.866. Okay, so it's positive again, so we stick with quadrant 1 and quadrant 2. We then have to take the inverse to find out what x is, so that's inverse sine 0.866. So we work that out, just put that in the calculator, we go inverse sine, and then put 0.866, and that has got 60 degrees. Okay, so in quadrant 1, x takes 60 degrees. We need to work out, we just put that quadrant 1, we need to work out what it is in quadrant 2, so we just say that is 180 minus 60, so x equals 120 in quadrant 2. So again, it's got two different values. We'll try, what about if we try cos? Okay, so here's another one. So we'll say cos x equals 0.707. You want to know what value x is, okay? No doubt I'll take two different values. So what we've got is, we have to think, well, it's positive, right? No negative there, so we know that every single function is positive in the first quadrant. Cos is also positive in the fourth quadrant. Okay, so it's always good to draw your wee diagram. Doesn't need to be as complex as this one, and just tick the areas. So we'll find out what x is by just taking the inverse cos of 0.707. The inverse cos of that is 45 degrees. So that's in quadrant 1. Okay, so quadrant 1 is just the inverse of x degrees. We then need to look at quadrant 4, in which it's also positive, and that is when it's 360 minus 45 degrees. We're just going with this wee rule. So that actually gives us 300, so x also equals 315 degrees. Okay, so that's its second value. Now I'll get another sheet of paper and we can try another type of question, and all it's different is the way it's actually written. So if I just take this sheet of paper, so these are really your exercise 3 but question 2 type questions. Okay, so this one is, we've got 2 cos x minus 1 equals 0, so you want to work out what x is, so we just have to rearrange this. So it's 2 cos x, we're going to add 1 to this side, so we need to add 1 to that side, equals 1. We want it just to be cos x, so we need to divide this side by 2. Okay, now we're left with cos x equals a half. Again, they're all positive in the first quadrant, and just like the last one, cos is positive in this quadrant as well. So we just take the inverse of it and put that in the calculator. So it's the inverse cos of 0.5, and that's 60. Okay, so in quadrant 1, x takes the value of 60. To find it in quadrant 4, what we need to obviously do is just follow the rule, and that rule just says have 360 and subtract x0, which is 360, x degrees should I say, subtract 60. So that also takes a value of 300. Okay, so that also takes a value of 300, so just write it a wee bit neater. So when you're seeing it in a different wee form, we just want to get it into the form of cos x, and then you eventually want it to get it into the form of just x. Now sometimes you end up with the value in which is actually a minus, so if I try and find one of these types of questions. So imagine you had sin x equals minus 0.5. Now we're looking for when sin is actually minus. Okay, so they're all positive in this quadrant, so we can't have it there. Sin is positive here, so it's quadrant 3 and quadrant 4 is when sin's minus. Okay, now what we have to do is still work out sin, and we work it out the exact same way, but you need to keep an eye on the sign. Okay, we're just going to ignore the sign and just work it out for 0.5. So x equals inverse sine 0.5, and that's 30. Now that's not for quadrant 1, that would be for there, but it's actually the third and fourth quadrant that we're looking for. So actually for quadrant 3, we need to say 180 plus 30, so x down here would equal 210. And we can then just say, I'll just put it here, for quadrant 4, it's 360 minus 30, so x takes a value of 330. Okay, so when it's a minus, you find the inverse function of the positive version, and we use that one to then substitute it into these wee rules. Okay, but always keep an eye on that, and that makes sense because if you look at your sine wave, remember that's 1, that's minus 1, it goes up to 1, it goes all the way down to minus 1, that's 180 degrees, and that's 360, and we're looking to see when it's 0.5 or minus 0.5. So that's the first quadrant, that's the second, that's the third, that's the fourth. So obviously just it does hit it within the third quadrant, and it also hits it in the fourth quadrant. So that's why we're using these rules, because we're looking at for when it's negative. Okay, hopefully that's helped out.